Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal. As part of our regular class coverage in the War Within Alpha, I want to dive back into the early build of the next expansion to preview 3 more hero specs. While not every class so far has even gained full access to every single one of the hero specs, the class of Mage, however, ended up being one of the lucky few. And with some of the changes coming to the Spellslinger hero spec, now all 3 of them, the Sunfury, Spellslinger, and the Frostfire, are fully ready for testing on the Alpha. By no means is the Mage class final in the current build of the Alpha, but I still wanted to take a bit of a deeper dive at some of these hero specs, talk about the mechanics, talk about the abilities, how the classes are evolving depending on these hero specs, as well as the thematic elements behind playing as a Sunfury, Frostfire, or a Spellslinger Mage. Right before that, if you guys want to see more War Within Alpha videos, be sure to subscribe, since most of you guys watching these kind of videos are still not subscribed. However, the more of you remind, the more of you do. So let's keep it going. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell if you're watching these videos anyway. Especially if you want to get more regular content regarding Dragonflight patch 10.26, 10.7, Season 4, or any of the future War Within updates. When it comes to Mage hero specs, I wanted to structure this video by starting off with the most popular, the most exciting hero specs, and then kind of talk about all of the less heard hero specs later down the line. So, off the bat, we have to cover Sunfury, which is the hero spec that got a lot of players excited. Sunfury mages are aided in battle by a mighty Spellfire Phoenix, further enhancing the most devastating incantations. And if you're a fan of Kael'thas Sunstrider from maybe Warcraft 3 or as a boss back in TBC, it essentially is Kael'thas, the hero spec of the Sunfury, fusing arcane magic and fire magic together into some of the most destructive combos available. On its face, the hero spec is actually kind of boring with its first ability, which is Spellfire Spheres. Every 6 times you consume a hot streak or clear casting, you conjure Spellfire Spheres, and while the spheres are active, all the spell damage is increased by 2%, stacking up to a maximum of 5 times, depending on how you talent your character. These orbs will also generate naturally whenever you're out of combat, to make sure that every time you're about to go into a combat scenario, you have all of these spheres available ahead of time. What really makes the sphere playstyle happen is the next talent, which is the Arcane Phoenix, where whenever you use your Combustion or Arcane Surge, you conjure this Phoenix that consumes all of those spheres to deal exceptional magic abilities. And this can be a variety of different things, and as we get into talents, we get to unlock a variety of spells such as Greater Pyroblast or Arcane Surge. The Phoenix can spell steal buffs from enemies and even knock him up in the air or knock him back, pyroblasting him everywhere, barraging enemies down. The Phoenix essentially has a mind of its own, and every time that I got to play with it, it does a ton of damage, especially once you can get enough spell spheres in order to fuel its carnage. But right now it doesn't really have a select target. And I've noticed moments where it will just start attacking a separate enemy entirely when I wanted to focus on the boss. Whoever gets hit by the Phoenix is going to get struck by it, but right now it has a little bit of a weird thing where it doesn't necessarily focus down on one singular target, which I think could maybe make it kind of bad in PvP, where let's say you want to polymorph the Mage, and then the Phoenix just starts blasting the Mage all on its own. So hopefully they'll end up kind of reining in some of its focus a little over the next few builds, but right now it is a very, very powerful pet that you don't really have any control over, that blends in this unpredictability of arcane and fire damage together into a very potent situation. And that's going to be at the core of the Sunfury playstyle, is it's all revolving around your Phoenix, and that's what makes it so effective yet simple. The rest of the talents are going to enhance your playstyle and buff aspects of your gameplay, but for the most part this playstyle is going to largely focus on the potential behind the Phoenix itself. We have talents such as Burden of Power. Whenever you conjure a Spellfire Sphere, you increase the damage of your next Pyroblast, Flame Strike, or one of your arcane abilities by a set amount. Further down, we have Glorious Incandescence, where consuming Burden of Power causes the next caster Phoenix Flames or Arcane Orb to call down a barrage of meteorites from the target. Each meteorite will also reduce the cooldown of one of your major abilities depending on your spec. On the flip side, we have Mana Addiction, where consuming Hot Streaks or Clear Casting will grant you haste over time, and multiple instances of this haste buff may also overlap. Further down, we have Merely a Setback. Not only is it a fantastic quote from a well-known WoW boss, but it also increases the value of your barrier, granting you additional avoidance, but also leech after it breaks. Then we have a choice now between Savor the Moment, which is either going to amplify the duration of your combustion or Arcane Surge. But on the flip side, you could also go Sunfury's Execution, which increases your execute value for either your Arcane Barrage or your Searing Touch ability. And it's kind of interesting because I don't really think of Fire Mage or Arcane Mage as an execute class, but they do have quite a bit of extra execute potential. Further down here, we actually have an interesting crowd control option called Gravity Lapse. At the snap of your fingers, it wraps gravity around the target, knocking them up into the air, suspending them for 3 seconds. Upon landing, nearby enemies around the target will take some arcane damage, and this you could use every 30 seconds to replace a blast wave. This talent is interesting because it grants fire and arcane mages kind of like a crowd control effect. And a lot of PvP mages are very excited about the pseudo-stun ability with Gravity Lapse and the potential that it has behind it. Though replacing things like Blast Wave is going to be interesting since Blast Wave is an effective tool that can knock enemies quite a distance and slow down the movement by quite a bit. On the flip side, if you don't want to run it, you can also learn Lessons of Delimitation and teach it to your Phoenix instead, where your Phoenix now can use Gravity Lapse, Supernova, as well as exceptional abilities and spell steals from enemy targets. Further down on the bottom right choice, we have Rondomancy, which allows Spellsfire spheres to now be stacked up to maximum of 5 stacks, which further fuels your Phoenix attacks. Or instead, you can go Ignite the Future, where generating a Spellsfire sphere while your Phoenix is already active causes it to instantly cast an exceptional spell. Right below the Phoenix talents, we have Codex of the Sunstrators. Summoning your Arcane Phoenix grants you a Spellfire sphere immediately. Your Arcane Phoenix can now cast Greater Pyroblast and Arcane Surges when casting an exceptional spell. And the final choice note is going to be Memory of Outlaw. While your Arcane Phoenix is active, you get twice as many stacks of Mana Addiction, so a ton of haste during your Prime Burst window. When the Arcane Phoenix expires, it empowers your character, and for Fire Mages it grants you Hyperthermia with its duration extended based on every single exceptional spell cast by your bird. And Hyperthermia allows your Pyroblast and Flame Strikes to have 0 cast time and always guarantee a critical strike, so it's almost like a mini combustion window. For Arcane Mages, it's a little bit different. It allows Arcane Barrage to cost no mana, grants you clear casting with every cast, and generates 4 Arcane Charges, which allows you to basically spam out a bunch of barrages to regenerate all of your resources while doing potentially high amounts of execute damage. And altogether, when it comes to actually playing this hero spec, either as Arcane or Fire, both specs synergize so well with Sunfury. For one, it's not really an intrusive playstyle, and all it really does is helps greatly to emphasize your burst window for either one of the 2 specs, which are very heavily leaning into the burst windows, being Combustion or Arcane Surge. The Phoenix itself is a fantastic pet that is also very powerful, but right now it has a bit of a control issue, and I wonder if it's meant to be an uncontrollable force of just chaos, or if it's essentially going to be focused down to prioritize whatever is your primary target. But for the most part, Sunfury is a straightforward playstyle that doesn't necessarily change mages either way, but it makes the burst windows a lot more exciting, and for the most part mages live around the burst windows anyway, so Sunfury helps emphasize a great core to both Fire and Arcane playstyles. Next up, we have the Frostfire Mage, which is, as the name implies, is available for both the specs of Fire as well as the specs of Frost. Frostfire Mages combines the elemental magic to unleash deadly fusions of ice and flame. And while it sounds an incredibly simple hero spec, it is also one of the more underrated, but I think this one has a ton of potential and quite a bit of gameplay involved. Initially, it seems like it's a spec that synergizes so much better for Frost, but it actually has a unique value for the spec of Fire in particular. The main mechanic of the Frostfire Mage is the Frostfire Mastery, where your fire spells and frost spells grant you different buffs. Fire spells will grant you stack and haze buffs, and frost spells will grant you stacking mastery up to 8 stacks each. Each one of your spells generates 1 stack of either of the element, and these stacks do not refresh. They simply build and then fade, and you have to build them back up again. For the most part, it's easy to maintain these stacks with the ability of Frostfire Bolt, which replaces your Frost Bolt. This ability does frostfire damage, which accounts for both the Frost Mastery and the Fire Mastery. This ability also will slow the enemy's move speed, being a Frostbolt similar, but also will deal damage over time, kind of like what a Fireball would. And this ability is going to be the prime ability that ties the spec together. However, all of the other talents are also going to allow for some Frost and Fire synergies. Starting with some of the choice nodes, like a defensive option of Elemental Affinity, which can grant you the cooldown reduction of Fire or Frost spells, whichever one is the opposite of your element. Or Cold Snap or your Cauterize will additionally reset the cooldown of the other mage's spell and abilities. Defensively, we have things like Imbued Warding, where Ice Barrier also casts Blazing Barrier, and reversal for those on the Fire spec. This also affects your Mass Barrier ability, so it grants you better protection. Or Meltdown, which is kind of a fun ability, and if you played in Torghast, this will be kind of familiar. You melt slightly out of your Ice Block and Ice Cold. Inside of Ice Block, it allows you also to move while Ice Block is active, increasing your movement speed over time. Ice Cold and Ice Block now trigger a Blazing Barrier at the end of either of the buffs, which again provides you a bit more protection. Talents such as Isothermic Core is going to have you lean into playing either with Comet Storm or Meteor, because casting one spell summons the other at either 100% or 150% effectiveness. With spells like Frostfire Infusion, your Frost or Fire abilities have a chance to trigger an additional bolt of Frostfire, which also benefits your Frostfire Mastery. In the middle, we have a choice node that can empower your Frostfire Bolt ability, either with Severe Temperature, where casting Frost or Fire spells increases the damage of your next Frostfire Bolt by a certain amount, stacking up to 5 times. Which is a little bit better for fire mages who are going to go through windows of Pyroblasting, Fire Blasting, Phoenix Flames, and then eventually they'll get back into casting the Frostfire Bolt. But for frost mages, you may prefer Thermal Conditioning, where Frostfire Bolt's cast time is reduced by 10% by a flat amount, since for frost mages it's your prime filler ability. Further down, we have even more frost and fire interactions like Excess Fire, reaching maximum stacks of Fire Mastery, causing next Ice Lance or Fire Blast to apply Living Bomb to enemies at 150% effectiveness. When Living Bomb expires, you either gain Brain Freeze or some cooldown reduction for your Phoenix Flame's ability. For Excess Frost, reaching maximum stacks of Frost Mastery, causing next Flurry or Phoenix Flames to cast an Ice Nova at 200% effectiveness. And when you consume Excess Frost, the cooldown of Comet Storm or Meteor is also further reduced. What really changes the whole playstyle of Frostfire and where it really starts to open up is in its Frostfire Empowerment passive, where Frost and Fire abilities all have a chance to activate Frostfire Empowerment, causing the next Frostfire Bolt to deal 100% increased damage and explode for 80% of the damage to all nearby foes, granting you maximum benefits of Frostfire Mastery and refreshing the duration of the buff if it is active. And to further amplify this Frostfire Empowerment, we have Flash Freeze Burn, where upon activating Combustion or Ice Veins, it instantly grants you Frostfire Empowerment. Now, the way the Frostfire mages are going to play for either Frost or Fire will be entirely different. For Frost mages, Frostfire Bolt essentially takes place of Frostbolt as a filler ability, and it essentially gets used in all types of situations. Overall, you generate a good amount of consistent Frost and Fire buffs to allow your Frostfire masteries to both kind of cycle out pretty regularly. Frost mages also have a ton of talents that naturally synergize with the ability of Frostbolt, which is encouraged for you to cast as much as possible, whether you're trying to cast Frostbolt to cleave multiple targets or looking to cast Frostbolts to empower your main cooldown windows. So Frost gets the most natural benefits of this playstyle by involving an ability that now gives you a couple of different procs that you're more encouraged to play into, and kind of ends up fueling a Frostbolt heavy playstyle in the long term, which just fits it so naturally. However, for specs such as Fire Mage, it's essentially a Frostbolt. And Frostbolt is a good ability, but it's mostly a primer ability, and it's something you generally tend to cast when there's nothing else to cast. You have abilities such as Fire Blast, Phoenix Flames, your Combustion Windows, Pyroblast. There's a lot of other things that take priority when it comes to playing a Fire Mage, so the Frostfire Bolt itself, for the most part, isn't going to have the same value of a regularly used spell. But even so, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have some hidden potential behind it. As somebody in the Mage Discord was able to discover and put together a build that focused for the most part on empowering your Ignite windows and focusing on as much single target damage as possible while playing around the Sun King's Blessing playstyle in order to mostly benefit from severe temperatures and Frostfire empowerments to fuel your entire barrage of fire abilities, creating an AoE but also a single target, mostly instant cast playstyle, which I don't really know how it's going to do damage-wise, but this one feels incredibly good to play with. And the Frostfire playstyle ends up complementing it effectively, especially with a lot of its other procs and other abilities that it adds into the rotation. Which, with our characters, we don't really have a lot of good stats. Like, our stats are just absolutely the worst they can be with this bare bones gear that's actually worse than the gear that we have on live over in Dragonflight. So we're playing with very undertuned characters in terms of just overall power and overall items, that this playstyle can only get even better as you actually optimize the character with the right stats and right builds. But altogether it creates an interesting playstyle that kind of highlights the power of Frostfire, where of course it's going to benefit Frost Mages since it replaces the Frostbolt ability that's used regularly, but even for Fire this ability and the playstyle has some kind of potential behind it, and it's going to be very exciting to see Mages unlock that potential fully, probably by the time the War Within expansion releases. But definitely don't be sleeping on the Frostfire combos for Frost or Fire Mage either. However, out of all the 3 hero specs, we now come to Spellslinger, and I think right now it's probably the most underappreciated hero spec by a wild margin, though some of you guys may actually, I think, enjoy the Spellslinger playstyle, especially if you're not a big fan of wild radical change heading into the next expansion. Spellslinger mages are prodigies of spellcasting and have learned to splinter their sorceries, creating powerful and volatile new effects shared between Frost and Arcane specs. Your main ability is going to be splintering sorcery. As Arcane, whenever you consume Nether Precision, which is a very baseline talent that is given to you fairly early on, or Winter's Chill as a Frost Mage, you conjure 2 Arcane Splinters that fire at your current target. These splinters are going to be Arcane or Frost by nature, depending on your spec, so they will be synergetic to whichever spec you end up playing. These Arcane Splinters will deal instant damage, but also will deal damage over time over 16 seconds, with its effect stacking per Arcane Splinter. From there on, the very first row is just basic damage amps like Splintering Orbs. Enemies damaged by your Arcane Orb or Frozen Orb will generate additional Arcane Splinters, and the damage of either orb is also being amped with this talent. In the middle we have some more Cleave with Controlled Instincts. For 8 seconds after being struck by an Arcane Orb or by a Blizzard, a portion of the direct damage dealt by an Arcane Splinter will now cleave all nearby enemies, with this damage soft capped beyond 5 targets. On the left hand side we have Augury Abounds. Casting Arcane Surge or Icy Veins conjures 8 Splinters instantly. During Arcane Surge or Icy Veins, whenever you conjure an Arcane Splinter, you have a 100% chance to conjure an additional Splinter on top of it. Then we have a couple of choice notes, starting with an offensive option with either Volatile Magic. Whenever an embedded Splinter is removed or recalled, it explodes, dealing a set amount of damage to nearby foes. Or instead you can use those splinters to buff the damage of your next Ice Nova or Supernova by a hefty amount. In the middle we have some defensive options like a Reactive Barrier, which is going to enhance your main barrier ability to absorb for more damage based on your missing health. The lower health you have, the better this barrier is going to be. But if you want a defensive cooldown, you can always go with Phantasmal Image, where your Mirror Image will now summon 1 additional clone to help redirect damage away from the mage, and Mirror Image now reduces all damage taken by an additional 5%. For mobility we have Slippery Slinging, where during Alter Time your movement is increased by 40%. Or if you end up playing with Displacement, you have a 50% longer duration on your displacement and a 25% longer range. Further down we have even more additional combat enhancements such as Force of Will, which increases your crit chance and crit damage. Spellfrost Teachings allows you direct damage from Arcane Splinters, a 5% chance to summon a Greater Arcane Echo that deals a little bit of damage to all nearby targets, but also now debuffs them to take 6% additional damage from the Mage, which is going to be a sizable damage buff in the process. On the left hand side we have Shifting Shards. During Shifting Power you fire a barrage of 8 Arcane Splinters at random enemies within 40 yards over its duration. So in AoE content you're gonna put Splinters in multiple targets, but in a single target you fire all 8 Splinters against your primary foe. And now lastly we have the capstone talent of Splinter Storm. Whenever you have 8 or more active embedded Arcane or Frost crystals, you automatically cast Splinter Storm towards your target, where you shatter all of those embedded splinters, dealing the remaining periodic damage instantly. Then you conjure a splinter for each one that was shattered, which then unleashes them in a devastating barrage, dealing frost or arcane damage to your target for each splinter in the Splinter Storm. For Frost Mages, Splinter Storm will apply Winter's Chill to its target directly, but for Arcane it's a 20% chance to grant clear casting, which all in all makes the Spellslinger hero spec a simple yet an effective playstyle that's going to be a lot more passive than everything that we've seen so far. Which some players have commented on going into War Within, that they hope that their specs and classes do get a bit of a refresher, maybe with their talents, maybe with some of their abilities, but for the most part players are hoping that they don't need to relearn an entirely new rotation for a spec that they already know and love. For example, let's say you love the way the Frost Mage plays right now in Dragonflight, and you don't really want to see that spec go through too many wild and uncomfortable changes, but you'd rather let it keep the same base that it has, the base that you like. Going into the next expansion, Spellslinger would complement that easily, because it doesn't necessarily change how a Frost Mage would play, but instead it enhances what is the base of the Arcane or Frost Mage, and that's essentially what Spellslinger is really good at. It keeps the core of either spec preserved, just enhancing it with whichever playstyle you choose to play as that spec. This one out of all of them seems to be the most simple, but kind of effective, with plenty of cleave opportunities, damage burst windows, and plenty of ways to generate additional defense, additional offense, or even to generate casts and procs. And even though Spellslinger for the most part seems like a very passive choice in comparison to everything we've seen so far, I think it actually has some hidden potential, because if it's tuned correctly, I think the damage it could put out could actually be kind of massive. Although we're probably not going to be seeing any final tuning until closer to the release of this expansion. But with that, that's going to be everything we got so far regarding some of the hero specs available to the class of Mage, which are all available for testing over on the alpha. And I'm still waiting for more classes to get access to more of the hero specs. We still have shamans who barely have any hero specs to test, except for one that is shared between Resto and Elemental. Then we have rogues, and I'm also expecting a ton of other changes to already existing hero specs that are not fully functional, not fully viable, and I'm thinking there's going to be a lot of adjustments going forward. However, the Mage so far looks solid. Whether we're looking at passive options such as the Spellslinger or the exciting bursty ones such as Sunfury, all of them seem to have some kind of a solidified ground with everything that we've seen on the alpha so far. And with some of the changes happening to Frostfire and Arcane specifically, it looks like they're changing to be complementary to these hero specs rather than going through wild transitions, which will lead to hero specs going through wild changes as well. But also, while we haven't seen the entire full potential of every single class for now, what we've seen so far out of Mages has gotten me super excited. All three specs feel refreshed, and a lot of the top end complexity is being softened down a bit. But when you combine the new versions of Mages plus these hero specs, there's a lot of opportunities there. And so far out of all the other classes, the Mage is the one that's the easiest to jump into and start enjoying yourself in the early alpha builds. Whether it is running delves, exploring dungeons, trying out different builds, or just being out in the open world, it feels like that they're really trying to solidify this class, and so far it has been one of the more enjoyable ones to explore on the alpha version. But with all that being said, at the end of the day, I want to hear your guys' thoughts in the comments down below. What do you think about the Mage hero specs so far? And out of the three that are available right now, the Sunfury, the Spellslinger, and the Frostfire, which one is currently your favorite? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. As per usual, if you guys enjoyed this video or found it informative, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. I would very much appreciate it. And as always, in the description of every single video and live stream, we have a link to our Discord community channel. Probably the best place to reach out to me directly in case you want to let me know what you thought about this video or hang out with the rest of the community to discuss some of the upcoming changes. Join our Discord to become part of the community. But otherwise, thank you all so much for watching this video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know all of your thoughts down below. And as always, I'll see all of you guys in another video.